Okay, I'm gonna go live.
Okay.
And we are live. Let's just wait a little bit. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Quadcast Weekly News. I am your host, Tim.
And I'm Mikey.
And this is Sahil. Welcome everybody to a brand new exciting episode of Quirkcast. A few logistical things to get out of the way. If you haven't already, do join our Discord channel so you can ask questions there. And if you're watching on YouTube, ask questions during the episode and we'll get to them as well. So without further ado, so Tim, right off the bat, I was reading this article that talked about two time dimensions discovered in some material. What what the heck is that all about? I thought there was only one time dimension. Like I remember learning from elementary school, like the concept of time and it flowing only in one direction. So can you break this down for us?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And indeed, I think you and I saw pretty much the same article over like Vice or Science Alert, whatever. I almost fell out of my chair when I just read the title. Scientists created two-time dimension. Like, what the heck can that mean in any particular way? And in a material, I mean, what a strange way to discover a new dimension, right? But 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 the further I dig deeper, the truth kind of sort of comes out. So first of all, the important thing to remember that we just have one time dimension. I don't care what science articles tells you otherwise or what online articles tells you. There is only one time dimension as far as we know. Okay, so that's it. So what's up with this two time dimension thing? So the crux is that what they were referring to is sort of like an artificial extra time dimension, and this extra time dimension, it's kind of like, if you would like, it's almost like the ticking of a clock, right? You can kind of just imagine, if you can kind of mess around with some kind of artificial clock that ticks in multiple different ways, then you can kind of argue that there may be a different, let's just say a different concept of time as opposed to like a totally different time dimension. So so the reality is that, yeah, not there wasn't really a new time dimension, but it's just that physicists created some really interesting system that at first glance could be kind of interpreted as having some kind of extra time dimension, but we'll dig deeper to that, right? So that's the crux.
Yeah, I guess like let's kind of take a step back because there's several words that I feel I've been taking for granted and since we're digging deep into such a fundamental sort of question like time and whatnot. What the heck is a dimension to start out with? Like it seems intuitive to me, but is there like a more precise definition of a dimension?
Yeah, I think I would go back to the mathematical definition that, a dimension, as we learn in geometry, is um, kind of the amount of uh, axes of freedom along which you can move, right? So if we just think of our native universe, we typically think of it as being three-dimensional because there are three spatial dimensions and you can describe it with an XYZ axis.
Mhm.
Um, and that's kind of the typical idea of a dimension. As I said, in our universe, we seem to have three spatial dimensions and one time dimension, but you can write down these theoretical, imaginary universes that have higher dimensions. And it turns out that the behavior of physics in the universes, in these imaginary universes, is intimately tied to the number of dimensions and the shapes of these dimensions. So I think it's important. One thing that's important to make clear here about this article is that um, they're basically talking about a simulation. So these people, they used a quantum computer. And what a quantum computer is, we like to think of quantum computers as like kind of being analogous to the kind of computers that we use. Like, can it do computations? Can it break codes? Can it do cryptography? Things like that. Um, but much more fundamentally, what a quantum computer is having that kind of manipulation, the same kind of manipulation that modern computers have over transistors is having that same kind of manipulative ability over like fundamental particles. So at that point, if you have control over these fundamental particles, you can kind of arrange them and simulate like a large range of different kinds of phenomenons. And that's why you see a lot of these things coming out in the news recently, like time crystals. Like people are learning how to arrange these fundamental particles in such a way that they can simulate all kinds of imaginary things now. Yeah.
I see. So why would you need two time dimensions for a quantum computer? I thought like you could just compute just using one time dimension. Why do you need two?
So yeah, so the easiest, I think quantum computers are kind of designed to simulate universes. They're not really designed to break codes. People talk about how it's going to break encryption, but we're going to simulate a universe way before we break RSA encryption. It's an easier thing to do because you're kind of using the fundamental stuff of the universe to simulate a universe. It's kind of like the natural language. So quantum computers don't need two time dimensions. These authors have simply arranged the quantum computer calculation in such a way that it kind of resembles an imaginary universe with two time dimensions.
How do you even know there's two time dimensions? Like, what does that even mean? Like, how? Yeah.
Let me just go over the article, or actually the forget about the article. Just look at the scientific result that came out. More specific detail. What they were studying was the type of what we call time crystal. And in time crystal, time is periodic. Obviously, in our universe, time is not periodic, but you can imagine a system where it's almost like a clockwork. Imagine the ticking of the clock goes around and around. It's very boring. It repeats again and again. I mean, if you live in this universe, it would kind of suck, right? It's like that movie, like Groundhog Day, whatever, right? It's like every day you just repeat, right? So when you do that, it's kind of like you creating one artificial time dimension, this periodic time dimension. And when they say they created two, they really mean that there's sort of two different types of periodicity. Like it's almost like the clock. The clock has different type of periodicity. There's the ticking of the second, and then there's the ticking of the minutes, right? And when those are incommensurate, you can kind of imagine like a really weird drum beat. It's like like short beat and long beat. When you make it really kind of incommensurate, but sort of periodic in a way, and they use the word quasi-periodic, kind of goes like a Fibonacci sequence. What I mean is that you can be like one short tick, two long tick, and then three short tick, five long tick, something like that. Then that kind of feels like, there's kind of progress going into, there are kind of two rates of time that's happening in the crystal. So in essence, it's when they say two-time dimension, they really mean like it's like a drum beat with two kinds of rhythm going on in a crystal, and that's what they're really talking about.
Oh, that makes sense. But there's still like fundamentally one time dimension. This is just more of a mathematical convenience to call it two time dimensions.
Exactly. What they're saying that if you squint really hard or you listen really hard, you can kind of distinguish the two beat kind of progressing independently. And like Mikey was saying, what is the dimension? Dimension is just this freedom to move, right? Like if I can take a step forward, I can take a step backward, I can take a step left, I can take a step right, or jump up and down. In the same way, this crystal can have a beat. It can have a short beat or it can have a long beat. And these beat kind of defines the time dimension. So this freedom for us to be able to tune this crystal to have this two kinds of drum beat, can mix and match them up, is what creates this illusion of two-time dimension. So once you break it down to that, it doesn't seem that fancy anymore.
I see. So I guess coming back to this article, or rather coming back to the concept of like a dimension, I get it's like in terms of X, Y, and Z, and then you have one of time. But I was hearing that there are these concepts of extra dimensions in string theory and other sorts of theories. And Mikey, you were mentioning the shape of dimensions. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by shape of dimensions?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to think about it is like what Tim described with the periodicity. So
Hmm.
for a long time, it was kind of an open question. If you go in one direction for an infinite amount of time, will you end up back where you started? And would you be as confused as someone who didn't know that the Earth was round, walking in one direction to wind back in the same place? We know now that this is not true. The universe does not curve back on itself. So that's the simplest, but it could have. It could have been that the universe did. We discovered that the universe did curve back on itself, and that would be the simplest example of like the shape of a dimension. And even that in that example, like whether or not it's curved back on itself or not, that by itself determines like the entire future evolution of the universe. So like physics is always tied to what shape these dimensions are in. In a sense, like these fundamental particles, right? What we described, like they have properties. You can kind of imagine the properties of those particles as kind of living in some extra dimension. So dimensions are kind of just a way, yeah, extra dimensions are kind of just like a way of describing the properties of points in space. You can always kind of describe them in a geometric way, and then you write down the equations, and it looks like an extra dimension. Yeah. The question is like whether or not these dimensions actually exist physically, or whether or not they're just like a convenient mathematical description. And I think there's a good reason to believe that those two things are equivalent. People have like a lot of ideas for how gravity could emerge. Comes from the idea that there could be extra dimensions of space, and if if those theories were true, you would actually be able to, if you were small enough, walk through these tiny little dimensions. That far out look like electric charge or something like that.
Huh. I guess like so are you saying these extra dimensions are like very small, or what are you saying about extra dimensions if they were to exist?
Yeah, if these extra dimensions are very small, they would be a very convenient mathematical tool for describing the properties of particles, right? Like you could imagine the electric charge could be determined by particles' motion through some small dimension that's too small for you to see. So when you're far away, it just looks like electric charge. Those kinds of mathematical theories are very convenient, and they're very compelling. And there's every reason to believe that if those theories are true, then these are real physical dimensions of space.
So you're
So
saying,
it could be that all the fundamental properties of all the fundamental particles that we know can, if you look really close, you see that all of those properties are due to the motions of these particles in some higher dimensional space.
huh? When you say motion, what does that mean in particular? Because if we're going at like a quantum mechanical level, it's like spread out, or what does motion mean in this context?
Yeah, so the simplest example, I guess, is like what's called a Kaluza-Klein theory, which is if you just
Uh,
assume that at very short distances, there's a little curled up dimension of space.
yeah.
If you assume that a quantum particle has some consistent momentum around that circle, if you zoom out, that looks just like electric charge.
Whoa.
So a lot of people, like, when people first discovered this in like the 1920s, I guess, it's very compelling, right? Like, it didn't have to be that way. It seems almost like it has to be true, right?
Interesting, huh? I guess then, so you could just create a new dimension for each property. Is that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that fair?
I mean, that's the game that model builders play, especially string theoretic model builders. And so if you have a quantum computer, you have the equations for how these dimensions are supposed to operate. You can, set up a simulation of this universe, even if it's not the one we live in. We
I
could
I
potentially
would
create one and have other beings grow up in that universe.
I would say it's not as easy as just kind of assigning a new dimension to every property, though. I mean, what it comes down to is this idea of motion, ultimately, right? Like it seems very intuitive to us. We can take a step forward, backward, left, and right, right? fundamentally what's going on when we move through space-time, we're kind of exciting this fabric of space-time. We're creating kinetic energy kind of in this really large space-time dimension. And intuitively to us, we are kind of, we're creating kind of disturbances, right? But for really small dimensions that are so small that we can't fit in, when we create motion, we pretty much kind of jiggle the entire dimensions. And those energy can manifest themselves as new types of particles, just like Mikey was saying. And so when we see a particular pattern of the types of particles and their masses, their properties, like electric charges, those could be hidden hints that tells us that there could be dimensions that we aren't able to access freely because we're too large, right? But I guess the ultimate arbiter of whether something is really a real dimension or not, I think it's gravity, because gravity sees all. I think it's kind of like the VIP of space-time, right? Like there are dimensions that we might not be able to access, but for it to be a legitimate dimension, the space-time itself has to be able to access it, and the space-time like I guess the VIP of space-time is graviton. It just itself basically. So I think that's fair, right? I think that to be a fair rule.
According to the movie Interstellar, there are two things that can transcend space and time: gravity and love.
So Tim, how do we become gravitons on this VIP?
How do we become gravitons?
Yeah.
I mean, actually, the thought might be that we might actually just be kind of like graviton. If you truly believe this grand idea of unification, we might just be particular types of graviton, except that we might be stuck. Just like for example, we are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and these are made up of quarks. So we're ultimately made up of quarks and electrons and maybe gluons, right? These are particles. And then you can ask the question, well, these particles, they live in 3+1 dimension, but can we pretend that the reason why these particles are not graviton could be because they somehow are gravitons, but like they somehow got jiggled in these extra dimensions in different ways, right? They for example, they could be stuck on different parts of the space-time. We call them these brains. Really, they're just like, I don't know, separate party floors for the fundamental building block of particles, right? They might just be stuck on different VIP floors, and then they get tagged, be like, hey, because you're stuck on this floor, this forces you to behave in a certain way, so your property becomes slightly deviate from the conventional graviton. So then, you know, string theory in this way kind of, you can try to use string theory to build configurations of these, like almost like this club, right? You can build these structure of these club to kind of put different particles on different dance floors to see, hey, maybe these are all patrons, right? These are all the same patrons, but they just kind of happen to be assigned to different groups.
That I like that analogy a lot.
We're stuck on the lowest level floor.
Well, I don't know if that's good or bad, right? Like, we can interact with each other. That's a pretty nice party floor, I think.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to slightly jump topics and discuss one thing that came to mind. And if it's too much, we can save it for a future episode. But things along like the holographic principle, where basically information is encoded on a 2D surface. And so if we're talking about extra dimensions, how does that work in some sense? I guess there's a lot to unpack there in terms of what I just said. Maybe we can start with like the information being encoded on 2 dimensions and then work our way from there.
I think we should first understand this idea of a projection. I think that's important, right? Like, for example, even this article, when we're talking about 2-time dimension, like, we don't literally observe the 2-time dimension. We only see a projection of it, because for sure the system itself has only one time dimension, because even in a quantum computer, you can only evolve things in one way, right? Of course, certainly you can assemble the beats differently, right? You can be like, how many long beats before a short beat, basically, and then kind of assemble, in this two-time dimension space, which way do you want to go, right? So this is a projection of a two-time dimension when these scientists create this two-time dimension system. What we see is a projection. And then, of course, this raises the question, right? Could we also be kind of projection of something else, right? Obviously, we see the only dimension we can access is 3 plus 1. And it seems like we're not projections because in kind of, you can kind of imagine like a dice, right? I guess I don't want to spoil the movie Interstellar, right? There was like a tesseract. I mean, at some point in the movie, you see projections of like a higher dimensional cube. Like if we were higher dimensional beings being projected, then imagine you see a being from a higher dimension. That being will be so shifty because they can move in that extra dimension, and their properties will dramatically change in real time in a really kind of unphysical way, right? So that would be like a hint of a projection, I would say, but at least in the vanilla way. I don't know. What do you think, Mikey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the easiest. We always just think of shadows, right? Like if you have a cube, it casts a shadow. When you move the cube around, the shadow seems to be morphing in ways that seem like material is growing and shrinking.
Yeah.
But if you look at it from the whole full space, you see that it's really just one object, and it's the projection that's changing. Yeah.
I see. So we're not projections because we're not changing in like really, really weird ways.
Right, but a caveat on that, right? Like we're not projection in the obvious way, right? Like if you imagine the most basic type of projection, like a tesseract or whatever, the tesseract move, like if I'm holding a tesseract in my hand, it might just change shape, like spontaneously. That would be the simplest way of projection. But who's to say, as we change in space-time, maybe in some really perverse, weird way, a convoluted way, that's actually showing a projection of some sort, right? So the holographic principle is kind of this viewpoint that perhaps some aspect of our universe can be viewed as a projection, but it's a projection in a much different fashion.
Yeah, I would go further to say that, it's the observation that we are we can be viewed as a projection, and it's not obvious that this projection exists. Like as Tim was saying, if you just imagine the shadow of a cube, like that's kind of the obvious way to identify a projection, the fact that it's like morphing in a weird way. There is a certain projection which people refer to as the holographic principle, which shows how we're kind of connected to the projection of ourselves on the boundary. It's basically like an encoding. This projection is kind of like taking the surface and encoding the information about our three-dimensional world on there. And it's not an obvious encoding. People have to work very long and hard to uncover exactly what that encoding is. And it's a striking thing. Do you have any other questions about it?
So one thing I wanted to ask is on the word projection, aren't we kind of morphing through time? Like we age, our skin changes, so like our form is changing in some sense, albeit very slowly based on our clock cycles.
Yeah, we are. I mean, we are.
Oh yeah, that's the other example of the straightforward projection, right? Like, yeah, you can just watch a video of a person. You're watching projections onto a slice of time, right?
Yeah. So you're okay. So in terms of space, we're not projections in like four spatial dimensions, but projections in the dimension of time. Did I understand that correctly? Or
Yeah, I mean, you can slice up. We have some spatial dimensions, we have some time dimensions, and you can project onto any of them and make a little story. But the holographic principle, I think, is something deeper than that. It's
okay,
saying that if you establish these dimensions, there is this kind of magical projection that you didn't know existed,
Yeah.
um,
Wait.
that
Actually,
allows you to think about it as a
they're
whole
actually.
different thing.
I think we got to clarify a little bit. There are actually two types of projection, right? One, the tesseract projecting onto ourselves. These are like from a higher dimension into a lower dimension. The holographic principle is actually slightly different. It's talking about there's a lower dimension, but through a projector, kind of projecting out, and then it's projecting from a lower dimension to higher dimension. I guess these are different ways of projecting. So you can project.
Wait, it's the same. You just reverse. I mean, wait. Uh,
Well, it's what's being projected, right?
you can't call it a projection, right? Because projection implies that information is being lost.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a little different. I guess we're not using the term very nicely.
Yeah, I guess we're.
Yeah, it's like a mapping. So the holographic principle, it's a little deeper, right? So basically, we project. Well, maybe it's the other way around, right? Like we are projecting ourselves on some boundary, and it's not just a projection. It's actually the hypothesis is that it's a one-to-one mapping.
An information preserving projection.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little stranger than that. But
yeah. So I guess coming back to this, the original reason I asked this question was to ascertain like if string theory talks about extra dimensions and like there's this not projection but this one-to-one information preserving mapping from 3 to 2 dimensions, like how does that work with extra dimensions?
yeah, okay. There's quite a bit to unpack there, but let me just say that there are there are different there are different kind of these different dualities. I think that's the best word I can come up with, right? String theory proposes that there are different relationship between theories in different dimensions. Like a 3-dimension theory might be related to a 2-dimension theory through a holographic, projection or holographic principle, and that in turn might be related to another different theory of different dimensions by dimensions curling up, right? So there are sort of these networks of theories that are related, one related to another by the holographic principle, which is just one possibility, or dimensions being curled up, or dimensions being stuck on a brain. It's like on different VIP floors, right? These are all slightly different concepts, but totally related through these webs of duality. And ultimately, when it's almost like a graph, I guess. Like you can have theory A is related to theory B, related to theory C, related to theory D, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And when they're all related, they're all actually one and the same theory, just different perspective of viewing it, right? So when we talk about these curled up dimensions, brains, and projections, holographic principle, these are all tools to relate theories from one to another to help us understand kind of the bigger picture, like what is those theories describing.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Is it just that it's easier to solve certain problems in other theories, and then when you solve them in those theories, then going back to the original theory that you were trying to solve the problem in, you can then solve it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, right? Like one reason why people like to do this kind of stuff in string theory, because string theory postulate that there's like 11, what is it, 10 plus like 11 dimensions, like 10 time and not 10 spatial dimension, 1 time dimension.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot to work with. If you just think about it, that's a lot, right? So one mathematical trick to deal with that is just like, let me just shrink a bunch of those dimensions, to shrink them to almost 0. And then the properties sort of become simpler, more organized. Then you can use these tricks to relate one theory to another. And then ultimately, then you can look back, be like, hey, guess what? If all these are related, if all these different theories are related, it probably didn't matter whether I curl these dimensions up or not. That was just a trick for me to unveil these relationships. And then you go back, you're like, hey, guess what? I just uncovered all these different interesting relationships. So yeah, I think like you said, these are fantastic mathematical tools for us to build these fantastical models to discover new relationships and new mathematics, as I would say.
Gotcha. So I guess like kind of taking a step back, we're at time. I guess like in like one thing I wanted to confirm from what Mikey was talking about is there like, I assume there's like a hypothesis slash theory out there that states that everything can be explained by the number of dimensions in their topology. Is that a fair statement? Like all properties of everything based on how these dimensions are curled up, how they're shaped, and whatnot.
Isn't that topological field theory?
I think people have tried. I wouldn't say the answer is yes. People have tried and hoped.
I mean, it seems like you could do. It seems like you could do that in the future. I think people are actively working on trying to like. I think there's some diehard people trying to show that this is true, and probably they will eventually. But I don't know.
Maybe maybe that's one. Well, I wouldn't definitively say yes. It's a tough problem. So.
Any concluding thoughts before we leave off? Tim, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll just jump back to the original article, just make it full circle, right? So let me just say that, there might be clickbait articles, but the conclusion is that we definitively did not create a new time dimension. We simulated something that may be perceived as kind of like an extra time, projections from an extra time dimension. And that itself is absolutely worthy of an article, but don't get overhyped. It's not a new time dimension. It's a very interesting system in a quantum computer, and it's very cool. So it's worth a read, but don't get too excited. There is only one time.
How about yourself, Mikey? Anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think I would just want to like kind of the way I would interpret an article like this, if you want to cut through the clickbait, is like just thinking of quantum computers like kind of like the early days of video games. When you make 8-bit Atari or Super Mario Brothers, you could argue that game makers have simulated a universe with 2 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, and Mario's going through it. And we're just starting to be able to do the rudimentary version of that with quantum computers. And these folks cooked up a video game that, looks like 2 time dimensions. So freaky things can happen, but, expect more things like this. Well before quantum computers become usable, there's going to be at least, hundreds of thousands of things like this, just kind of bizarre oddities that people are going to arrange with. In the engineering process.
Very cool. I look forward to seeing more news about that. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks for joining. See you all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.